We just finished talking about when we help other people. And the answer to that, at least according to Latney and Darley, is when there are less people around. That's when we help. So the last real piece of this that we need to talk about are the factors that increase helping. And I would love to spend more time talking about what variables influence whether or not we help people. And there's a lot of them, right? It's kind of like um, the very beginning of this lecture or this topic in particular, where I talked about how aggression and pro-social behavior are not necessarily the same, opposite sides of the same coin. I did talk about that because I said that the processes are different, right? When you talked about aggression, we talked about the general aggression model, and notice how that doesn't really align or match up well with any of the theories we talked about for why people help. Like, for example, you don't see a lot of overlap between the general aggression model and the empathy altruism hypothesis, right? So the processes are different. But when we talk about the factors that relate to helping, we are more or less talking about the factors that are positively correlated with helping, but also at the same time negatively correlated with aggression. All right. So there is a lot of overlap there, which is why I don't spend as much time as I probably should on it. But the one I wanted to bring up is probably a less intuitive one, and that's going to be the media. And so the idea here is we talked about a study in the aggression domain, my study, that showed that if you play a violent versus nonviolent game, you have an increase in your aggressive thoughts. And the increase in your aggressive thoughts leads to increases in aggressive behavior. And that explains why video game violence causes people to be aggressive. All right. So we talked about that, but what about the pro-social side of this thing? And this is what Gentile and his colleagues did, is to look at that. Is okay. What about if if antisocial or violent media primes people to be aggressive, can pro-social media prime people to be helpful? Right. So what do we mean by pro-social media? Well, this is a little bit of a trickier thing to talk about. When I say the word like media violence, you know exactly what I mean, right? It's clear. When I say media pro-social exposure, you're just like, I don't know what that means. And that's because there's just not a lot of good shows or video games out there that depict a character doing extremely helpful behaviors. All right? There are some, don't get me wrong. They're just not marketed well because they don't sell well, to be honest. All right. Sadly, in our world, people would rather see, Grand Theft Auto, where, a guy steals a car and grabs a hooker and then beats her up and takes her money. Like, people would rather see that than helping people, but whatever. And so what they did is they did a longitudinal study with kids. All right. So what they did with these kids is they measured two variables. So at time 1 and time 2. All right. At time 1, what they did is they measured helping behavior. So how pro-social are you? And then they also measured media pro-social exposure. All right. The question for this, the pro-social one, the question for that was basically to list your favorite TV shows, your favorite movies, and your favorite video game. So after you list the title of it, afterwards you ask, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do characters help each other? All right, that was their measure. And what they found, and so the time lag here is 3 months, so not a very long study. It's a longitudinal study. It's not like the Huseman stuff, which is like 10 to 22 years. It's a very short study. But what they found is this relationship here was significant. The correlation was really weak, 0.09, but it was statistically significant. And what this tells us, even though it's really weak, what this tells us is that as media pro-social behavior increases at time 1, it makes you a more helpful person at time 2. Weekly. It's very weak, although statistically significant. I told you this at exam for the exam 1 material, is that we get excited for significant correlations, even though we know in social psych they tend to be weak. So let me get that number up there. We found a positive longitudinal correlation. However, because of how weak it was, Gentile didn't just stop there. So he also wanted to conceptually replicate this. Conceptual replication means showing the same effect, doing something different. So what they wanted to do is, instead of a longitudinal study, they wanted to do something experimental. And so they randomly assigned kids to play one of three games: a pro-social, a neutral, or an antisocial video game. Now, here's what they did here. So, we've gone through examples of neutral games. We've gone through examples of antisocial or aggressive games, but we've never talked about pro-social games before. So in this pro-social game, they had a couple. I don't know if you've ever heard of these before. There were two that were the most important here. One is going to be called Super Mario Sunshine. I'm never going to test you on what the game titles are. I just want you to see what these games look like. So the Super Mario Sunshine, what happens here is it's a Nintendo game. You're Mario, and the Super Mario world has just been kind of littered with paint all over the place. So I haven't played the game, but I've seen still clips of it, and I've where there's a level where you have a hose and you have to run around cleaning up a park with this hose. All right, so it's pro-social in the sense that you're helping, right? You're helping clean up this park. Another game they played was a game called Chibi Robo, where basically your character, your video game character, is this little itty bitty robot, like the size of like a finger, like a thumb. And what happens is your job is, while people are out of the house, you clean up for them. So you are I never played it, but the screenshots that I've seen, you're armed with like a toothbrush. And because you're the size of a thumb, the toothbrush is like this massive cleaning thing, and you run around like the kitchen, for example, scrubbing and cleaning. Pro-social. Notice how none of these games sound fun. And that makes sense because these games suck. Those games are not fun. And in my opinion, they suck. And I would never play them. And that's part of the issue with trying to market a pro-social game, is that how do you make it fun? Well, guess what? Cleaning a sink isn't exactly a fun experience. But needless to say, for the purposes of this experimental work, that's the kind of pro-social games people played. All right. Now, when it was all over, people, participants in this study, they did a task to measure pro-social behavior, and that was the dependent variable. And here's what we see here. So this is the amount of helping on the y-axis here. This is helping. The higher the score, the more you help. And what they found was that if you played the pro-social game, you helped significantly more than if you played the violent game, as you would expect. And so, in other words, what they found is a relationship between helping, what you're exposed to, and helping behavior. There's been follow-up work that showed the reason why this effect occurs is because of priming. So if you play a pro-social game, you will be primed with pro-social thoughts, which predict pro-social behavior. So the overall kind of long story about this is Gentile did conceptually replicate. He did replicate. He showed that the pro-social game led to more pro-social behaviors. And what's happening here in this particular work is that it does mirror the aggression work. And even though theoretically things are different in terms of how pro-social behavior works versus how aggressive behavior works, in terms of the why do we help, even though when we help doesn't always equate to when we aggress, just the opposite. What's going to happen here is the factors that do influence aggression also influence helping. Just it's the mirror of it. All right, so the psychological processes are the same. Video game exposure leads to priming, which leads to the behavior consistent with the priming and what you see on the television. And that matches here as well. And that's it for helping. So we're done with topic 10. This will take us, these are the 3 topics that'll be for exam number 3. And I'll start recording exam 4 stuff soon.